Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Level Up podcast. I'm Ken Rose. I'm CTO and co-founder at Ops Level. And today we have with us Seth Lochen. He is a senior engineering manager at Groupon, where he's part of the platform and engineering tools team. And on that team, him and the teams are responsible for release and production tooling. So Seth, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ken.
Cheers. So you've been at Groupon since early days in 2010. Can you tell me a little bit about what you work on at Groupon?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm part of the platform and engineering tools team. My specific duties are managing the CI/CD team, the logging platform team, and the service portal team, which has a lot of overlap with ops level. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that today. And like you said, I've been there 11 and a half years, which is kind of long in sort of any tech firm. But yeah, it's been interesting to see Groupon sort of evolve over the years, and my role has evolved with it. So.
Cool. Can you talk a little bit about like what that evolutions look like and how your team kind of came into existence?
Yeah, and it's actually kind of a good story in terms of why we built Service Portal. So Groupon started as a monolithic Ruby on Rails app. We ended up having hundreds and hundreds of developers all sort of committing to the same code base and dealt with sort of scale in that sense. I remember back in those days for CI/CD, we were working a lot on sort of build parallelization to make sure the build didn't take forever. And then as necessary as we scaled up, we had to sort of break that monolith into pieces. And so we headed towards kind of the classic service-oriented architecture, or sort of microservice architecture. And as we did that, you sort of start to lose track of how many services there are. It started easy with carving off maybe sort of like the orders bits or the users bits, but little by little, we sort of built up more and more microservices, and even built a framework to build a bunch of Node.js services for our front end, another framework to build a bunch of Java services for API, which just sort of led to an explosion of services. And so it was hard for our SRE and ops folks to sort of keep track of who owned what and what service did what and how they integrated with each other. And so Service Portal was sort of born out of the need to understand what the overall architecture looked like at a high level, and then be able to sort of tie ownership to services so we knew who to contact if something was broken. And over time, we've just continued to sort of add more and more to that service portal to allow us to sort of do cross-service reporting and even get into some of our sort of SDLC automation, leveraging our own service portal API to make decisions, things like that. So sort of as we went from monolith to service-oriented architecture, Service Portal became sort of this necessary hub that gave us the ability to sort of manage that service sprawl.
Cool. I definitely going to want to learn a whole lot more about Service Portal. You talked a little bit about like one of the problems being kind of associating here's a service and here's the team that owns it. Just at a high level, can you talk about as Groupon transition from that monorail to microservices? How did and how does service ownership work at Groupon?
Yeah, I think ownership itself has sort of evolved over the years also. I think initially we just sort of associated sort of high level owners, maybe VPs or senior leaders, with which services rolled up to them. And that was useful for sort of cross service reporting stuff where, say you had a bunch of services moving from, some platform to another. For instance, we're moving our logging platforms right now. So it's really useful to be able to say, hey, this VP, all their services moved, and this other one, they're kind of lagging, so we got to get on top of them. I think we found it more useful once we added sort of a more granular ownership where you could get down to sort of the individual manager level or even lower, maybe like a lead engineer, because that allows us to sort of, we started doing sort of a service scoring where we're looking at health of certain things and just being able to look at that at a more granular level and then be able to assign tasks to people who are actually going to go do the work. Because if you give it to a VP, they're going to end up delegating it all anyway. So we now track ownership at a variety of levels. So sort of a senior technical leader, we've got sort of the immediate manager, we have tech lead in there, and even for some services, we track product owner. And all that information is tracked internally. And then as we see change within Groupon's staff, we have some sort of automatic escalation rules that kick in. If a person leaves and they happen to own a service, we will escalate that up to their direct manager, and on and up the chain until we find somebody who is still around and can sort of correct the ownership there. So we never end up with a service that's essentially just unowned. And that was a big part of a push we made on Service Portal generally in terms of sort of automating the data that was captured in there. So if I segue away a bit from the original question, as we onboarded more and more services and captured service ownership, we found that a lot of the metadata we were capturing in Service Portal was sort of manually entered by those owners. And so the ownership itself was sort of the first thing to solve, I guess, by making sure that was accurate at all times. And then once we had that, we could then leverage that to make sure the rest of the metadata for those services was also accurate. And once we had improved all the accuracy in the Service Portal metadata and service reporting data that we had, it basically unlocked the ability to automate a lot of things where previously we couldn't really rely on it to do any sort of automations, because then you come along and a team would say, hey, that's not right. So yeah, I think the ownership for us has allowed us to, like I said, improve the data itself that's being put in there, but then also improves our ability for the operations and SRE teams to find the person that's responsible for the service and take action, whether it's, to deal with some sort of incident or just deal with sort of service health, kind of everyday checks kind of thing.
Cool. So it sounds like it's not so much an individual team that owns a service then, but more this like group of people, right? There's like an engineering lead and an engineering manager and a product owner.
Yeah. And, ownership, I think, still sort of boils down to that one person. I think what we found is, I guess it's the same if you send out like an email blast to a bunch of people. It's easy for an individual to sort of hide behind the group and say, somebody else will deal with it.
Bystander effect, tragedy,
yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we found is it's better to have that one contact that you can sort of roll the ownership into. So even if there is kind of this shared ownership of, a senior technical leader may be making architectural decisions, the product person may be working on the roadmap, there still is that one owner that you can contact if you need an answer to a question, and you're not being bounced around per se. You're sort of like, that is the owner. So I think it's important to have that so you don't, like you said, get that bystander effect.
Right. And you kind of touched on this, some of the reasons you built Service Portal, but why do you think that service ownership is important?
I think one is that bystander effect. The other is sort of, we at Groupon, the services themselves have been around long enough that you start to see varying degrees of like modernity to the various services and their underlying architectures and technology. So it's sort of inevitable that some set of services will lag and they'll be running a bunch of old stuff, or they'll have vulnerabilities or what have you. And being able to report across all of those and determine, sort of what's our sort of average risk level, or what's the average age of all these frameworks that we should be updating. And then being able to go and enact change, because if you could do that reporting and then say, here's all the services that need to update, and then these are the ones that are doing okay. If you can't then go assign that work to somebody and know that person is going to be directly responsible for completing that work, then you're kind of spending a lot of time looking for the right person to own it. So it allows us to just sort of cut right to the chase and say, here's all the people that need to be informed of some system change or some update we're making to the platform. So I think on the platform engineering side, it's been really useful for us to sort of push out changes to the product side of our engineering organization and say, hey, all you owners, we need XYZ by this quarter. And so it allows us to sort of work on those larger cross-platform initiatives, which tend to happen more often than you think.
Cool. What are some examples actually of some of those like cross-cutting initiatives that you folks have to run? I think you mentioned the logging migration.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number, right? So it's any of the internal frameworks we write. Like I mentioned, we've got an internal application framework for our Node.js front-end apps. Same for our API apps on Java. Those are all sort of bootstrapped from these application frameworks we built, and that framework itself, or those frameworks, are versioned. And so then as those apps are built and maintained, they can lag behind if they're not updating. So you'll see us sort of asking teams to update and running reports across those to say, you're running version A or B. And then like the platform changes can happen as well, where maybe the service teams themselves aren't as involved, where on the back end, we're doing, moving our infrastructure from one place to another, or changing the actual underlying technology behind an API without necessarily disrupting the product teams. And even if we're not asking them to go do anything, we're trying to make it somewhat of a transparent migration, it still allows us to sort of scope our own work and say, hey, here's a set of services that fall into this bucket. Here's a bunch of metadata about those services, so we can kind of break down the different migration products into phases or waves. And so it gives us the ability to sort of better manage those types of large cross-service initiatives. So yeah, like I said, it's sort of logging, tooling changes, framework updates, infrastructure migrations,
stuff.
Yeah.
Very cool. So I'd love to dive in a little bit more into Service Portal and some of its origin story. Like, at what point did Groupon kind of realize, like, hey, we need a tool, or how did Service Portal kind of come into being?
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered most of it at the top. It's sort of that monolith to microservice journey, and losing track of what services do what and who owns them and how they integrate with each other. So as we moved from a single service to hundreds of services, it made sense for us to have that central hub where we could go register that data as a service owner and say, here's my service, here's what I use, here's who I depend on, and here's some additional data about the team, et cetera. And then additionally, for the ops and SRE folks, they can come there as a central place and find out who they need to contact, or say, if one particular service is having an issue, knowing what other services kind of related in that same sphere might need to be contacted, or sort of get them ready to page if there's some issue. So it's been sort of a necessary part of our operations. And I think as we enriched the data and made it higher quality, like I said, we were able to automate parts of our SDLC. So we'll do one large portion of Service Portal that we built up are called health checks. And so, although we started by just saying, hey, we need a bunch of metadata in here just so we can keep track of what all this stuff is, that obviously evolved into, let's leverage this to make decisions in an automated way, just for better efficiency. So we put a lot of emphasis on health of a service and sort of operational readiness. And so we have a collection of health checks that we do run and say, this service has, the set of health checks is sort of all over the place. It could be sort of static stuff that's just, hey, your config or your docs or your architectural diagrams are in good shape, all the way up to sort of like live running checks on sort of SLOs and SLIs, sort of like observability data in production. So it sort of spans the gap from static config to live data. And based on that, we're making health determinations for a service, which we can then leverage for decisions in sort of our CI/CD pipeline. So, we're not necessarily at the point where we're adding too many hurdles because we can't necessarily afford it from like a CI/CD standpoint. We don't want to like slow everybody down, but we are injecting more and more checks, whether it's for vulnerabilities during our building process, or come deployment, if you're got a red health score because you had a bunch of sevs or there's something wrong with your metadata. I think we use the deploy gate as sort of a stick that we can wield and say, right, hey, you're not compliant with all these different things, so you can't deploy, or if you're going to deploy, you have to deploy in these very specific windows that are lower risk for the org. So I think it's sort of, the origin was sort of sprung out of just the need to track the explosion of services. But then, as we added more data, we got to use it more for our daily operations.
Got it. And so, yeah, and it's now more, this is almost this like service maturity tracking tool. And you mentioned a bunch of concerns around like static config data, and then security with vulnerabilities and reliability, and I guess reliability and observability, like how many SES have you had, and how good is your service right now? What's interesting is you mentioned tying that into your CI/CD pipeline, which is a pretty big stick. I'm almost imagining it's like you can't deploy. I get, whenever I think of CD, it's okay, you as a team are empowered to deploy. You can deploy whenever you want. What you're saying is actually no. If your service maturity is too low, you aren't allowed, or you have to. You can only deploy at certain times, or kind of, I don't know, with training wheels, or when there's support, until you kind of improve your score. Is that kind of an accurate assessment?
Yeah, and early days it was sort of the all or nothing, right? It was like you're either healthy and you can deploy or not, and you can't until you fix it. And then over time, we've even evolved that a bit to be a bit more nuanced, where if we deem a service is, I think we have a tier attribute that we put on a service to determine whether it's kind of a core or a non-core service, whether or not it's sort of like right in our purchase funnel, and if it goes down, you're jeopardizing Groupon's bottom line versus some other service that's maybe more of a supporting one that if it's down doesn't have as big of an effect. And that kind of metadata allows us to be a bit more nuanced in our decision making there, where we can say, if you've got a red health score and your core, and you've had a history of SEVs or whatever it is, we can kind of tighten the screws a bit more there. Whereas maybe we're a little more lenient with some of these other services that aren't necessarily in that critical path.
Got it. So there's kind of more rigor that needs to be applied for those like more important, like business critical services.
Right. And it's the kind of thing that, we probably wouldn't have built from day one. You sort of build on top of that base functionality. And like I said, we've had it now for 7 or 8 years. And so I think we continue to sort of evolve the feature set to map to Groupon's needs, given all the metadata we've sort of accrued over time.
In terms of that service maturity, right? You have described one mechanism of like the stick and punishing the red services, right? Or services that aren't doing well. Are there any carrots that you folks have, or any ways you celebrate the kind of the green services?
Yeah, and what's funny is I think Service Portal's original goal was to sort of be the carrot, right? We wanted to make it easier for people to find things. I think originally we provided better tooling in the service itself, and so I think that's actually one balance that we need to sort of, I guess, help out on the other end of the spectrum. Is we have leaned pretty far into the risk mitigation, sort of keeping the lights on and operations smooth, and have sort of lost a little bit of our sort of developer productivity or efficiency features. So things we do have in there are, say, easy sort of API documentation. So if you use one of our API clients, then and make sure your docs are sort of structured correctly, then we'll host your schema for you, and other teams can find those. There's other things to sort of like celebrate. We have a thing internally called equitable language in tech, which is to make sure we're not using certain terms that are sort of frowned upon or sort of culturally insensitive. And so as luck would have it, there's a variety of tools out there that are using language that, frankly, we shouldn't be using anymore. So we've kind of got a list of those words, and we do some scanning within Service Portal. And if your repos sort of pass the grade, then you get, we have some like a badging type thing on there. So you can get like the big ELIT badge. There's badges for inner source. So if your repos or products internally are sort of open to other teams contributing pull requests, and you've sort of defined the house rules for how teams can do that for your repo, we'll stick a big inner source tag on your repos and stuff like that. So I think there's probably more work we can do in sort of the carrot realm. But yeah, we're certainly trying to balance that part out.
Okay. Now, this is going to sound like an obvious question, and I can speculate your answer here, but you're doing a lot of work to collect this, and measure this service maturity across, all the services at Groupon. Why is that service maturity important for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the service maturity for us is both sort of health of the service, right? We don't want people using software that maybe has vulnerabilities that have been either exposed or used outside of Groupon, and we find out about it and we're like, hey, we got to go patch that up. And then similarly, we don't want to fall too behind because it makes service ownership and maintenance hard to do. We actually ran into this with a recent migration of our CI systems. As part of our old CI system, we cached a lot of dependencies that teams would use just for efficiency. So when a new build would spin up, they didn't have to download the entire internet from Maven again. So in doing so, though, we didn't realize that we were caching a lot of really old stuff. And so when we asked teams to migrate from one system to the other, and we told them, hey, we're not going to migrate all your cache dependencies, a lot of teams actually ran into situations where their libraries and dependencies were so old they aren't even available in the
they're not published
repository. Yeah. So if you're falling that far behind, you're kind of putting yourself at risk in terms of your service just being operational. And so I think that's where kind of the maturity level of these services, it's in the entire best interest of the engineering org to sort of keep that at a healthy balance along with sort of product work to sort of keep those things up to date.
Yeah, it's funny. It's cache invalidation always that is like the kind of the
Yeah,
joke problem in computer science, and
yeah,
that
exactly.
literally was the problem that was here. Another thing you kind of talked about around service maturity was like SLIs and SLOs. How do you, I think a lot of companies struggle in terms of like when they're defining their SLIs, like what are good SLIs to define? What's the balance of, how much is it the platform team that's doing it? Is it the feature teams that doing it? Can you talk to me a little bit about like how do SLIs and SLOs kind of fit into Groupon's kind of thoughts on service health and service maturity?
Yeah, it's actually a relatively new area for us. Not new in the sense that we haven't talked about it for a while, but new in the sense that we're actually building features around it. And so we're starting with what are called, I guess, the red metrics, which I believe are response time, error rate, and duration, which is another word for latency. And so, we read a bunch of the sort of Google blog posts about this, and we're kind of starting with those big three. And as it stands, the ability for teams to come in and enter SLIs and SLO data into the service portal at Groupon, it's sort of being released as we speak. So the team is working on that right now. We know we're focusing on those three main metrics, and I think we're gonna see how it goes. So I think we're kind of in that early stage of, we can define some sort of high level thresholds where we say, hey, 3 nines or some percentage of error rate is acceptable. But it's really going to come back to those service owners that we talked about before, because they'll have better context on what's acceptable for their applications, what business impact they have if error rates are at a certain level or latencies at a certain level. So we may have some sort of platform wide or organization wide thresholds that we won't go below or over. But I think we'll allow some nuanced service to service is defined by the service owner.
Yeah, I can imagine again, maybe a similar thing that you described earlier, like tier one services or those business critical services have like stricter requirements, or maybe the teams aren't in control of that. But if you're like a tier three service, you can kind of be more in control of your own destiny.
Right. And I think, as this thing evolves, I'm sure we'll end up leveraging that metadata. We tend to sort of practice that iterative development. So I think as we launch that thing, it'll probably be pretty bare bones, like it's either on or it's off. But yeah, longer term, I imagine we'll get more specific with it, and the hope is to basically leverage that data along with some distributed tracing data we're working on as well, to just get a better idea of how Groupon's platform is performing, and even in cases allow us to determine, hey, can we be a bit more risky with the service and shift the balance of sort of tech debt priorities and product priorities to a more kind of product heavy ratio if the service is doing really well. If they have a history of meeting all of their thresholds, maybe we're being a bit too conservative, and we can kind of open the floodgates a bit more on the product side.
Yeah, I've heard this quote, and I don't remember where it's from, but SLIs are like the interface between the business and engineering, where it's like that's how that both sides can agree on like, yes, engineering is doing enough, and if SLIs drop too far low, then that's the tripwire for the engineering team to say, okay, we need to go like fix things before we can do any more product work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, the red metrics are kind of the foundational ones. They're pretty low level that I'm not sure business side would know or care what those are. But if you can, our hope is to basically evolve this up to a thing where we can say, X number of orders, or sort of put it in business terms.
Yeah.
We can say, this is our actual service level objective. And although that may boil down to a bunch of counters and histograms in the back end, we can let the business folks know, like, hey, we're delivering on this business agreement. So yeah, that's the idea.
Cool. I want to talk a little bit about platform teams, right? I think you're on a platform team now. It might have had some name changes over the years, but I think in spirit, it's always been about like helping, engineers across Groupon, be better and faster and move quicker and be more supported so they can focus just on their business logic. What are your thoughts on like just platform teams and what's worked and what hasn't?
Yeah, I think a platform team in general, it's an interesting thing, because I think for a really, really small company, you tend to have folks who are maybe sort of the jack of all trades type, or they're kind of like the DevOps guy or gal. And they tend to wear a lot of hats and sort of go figure stuff out. Maybe they set up the Jenkins server, maybe they do deploys, whatever it may be. I think once you reach a certain level, like a certain scale of organization, it's worth it then to sort of specialize and have a team that's entirely dedicated to that stuff, because you start to see the efficiencies of scale there, where that team is providing platform or tooling or automation that the rest of the engineers can simply use without really having to think about it too much. So if they can kind of plug in and focus more on producing product and working with the business side, and the platform can just make sure they're making that as fast and easy as possible, it really pays off in the long run.
Right on. In terms of your experience with Groupon, can you talk a little bit about the kind of the interface that you have between what your team does and what the feature teams do? Like, how did Groupon kind of figure out where the balance is between like, oh, this is clearly on the platform side of things, and this is clearly on the feature teams side of things?
Sure. Yeah, I think that has evolved also over the years. I think we started as a fairly small shop, and I was one of those people I was describing that sort of wore a lot of hats and helped the engineers get product shipped. I think as we scaled up and the platform team became a more dedicated piece of the overall org, me and my teams tend to sort of lose a little bit of touch with what product we're delivering. I joke that, we could be selling shoes or widgets or whatever it is, and it wouldn't matter because we're still providing the same sort of engineering platform to write software and ship it. So I think that's actually gotten better in recent years. Groupon actually tries now to run our platform org a bit more like a product org and treating our internal customers like the customers that they are. And as a result, we've actually been hiring and staffing product developers for our platform teams. I think historically it was sort of just on the platform teams to do their own product roadmap prioritization. And that works fine. But platform teams can kind of lose focus and go down the sort of like infinite optimization road.
Right. The engineering bits and forgetting about their actual user.
Yeah. And you can, there's certainly no shortage of work. We can always go and make something faster or better, but that's not necessarily the right investment if the product teams, need some new solution or something's not working for them. So I've actually seen a much better relationship now between sort of the platform and product silos, now that we have dedicated product owners that work with me, the platform service owner, and the other product service owners or feature team service owners, and kind of help bridge that gap and run sort of, demos, and we gather requirements and treat it much like you would any sort of feature team. So
yeah, like an actual like product discovery process, product prioritization, figuring out what to build, and then going ahead and executing it.
Yeah, and it seems silly to talk about it like it's some, new idea. It's really just sort of embracing it to the point where we're, like I said, we're hiring and staffing for that, as opposed to just assuming that, hey, these platform folks can take care of it themselves. We need to leverage the product folks that we do have for sort of the customer or merchant facing feature teams on Groupon.
Yeah. Something you talked about is kind of like that transition from small company to large company. Do you have a sense of when is the right time to introduce that formalism of like, hey, like we need to actually carve this out as a separate team?
Yeah, I guess I don't have some, magic algorithm where it's like, hey, you reach, 50 engineers or something and suddenly you flip the switch. I think it's more of like if you find that your product teams or your feature teams are spending, as much or more time getting stuff out the door as they are actually working on the stuff, then that's a problem. And so I think the part of it is probably, allowing those teams to dictate that themselves and say, hey, we need to spend more time paying down this tech debt. I think at Groupon, it sort of naturally occurred as we staffed up. We found that, the efficiencies of scale of having a dedicated CI/CD release engineering person paid out, and the engineers didn't want to be dealing with Jenkins. And so you hire somebody to go do it. So yeah, I don't know what the magic formula is. I just know that at some point you're going to spend more time dealing with shipping product than the product. Then it's time to sort of get some teams dedicated to making that not the case anymore.
I really like that. We had a similar problem at ops level where like our CI times were getting longer and longer, and we realized we needed to invest, and now we finally have. But I don't think we consciously thought of it in terms of like that's the metric. Like look at how painful CI is. It's like, oh, CI is painful. Obviously, we need to go fix that. But actually making that the explicit metric, like, and now is the time to like invest in a platform person.
Yeah, and it's a hard thing, right? Because it's like I forget what the analogy is. I'm gonna get it horribly wrong, but it's like the frog in the pot when the water.
Oh yeah, the boiling frog.
Yeah. Like you don't realize how bad it is because you sort of normalize waiting on these CI builds or this horrible manual deploy process. And a lot of times it takes hiring, the act of scaling up and somebody coming in from outside saying, oh my God, what are you doing? Or how can you live this way? And so I think that helps. And then, yeah, I guess as you're scaling and that pain gets worse and worse, I think the expectation is the amount of work you're doing as you scale should be more, right? So as you're hiring more and more staff, you'd expect sort of greater and greater productivity. But I imagine that sort of starts to flatten out if the tooling isn't there to support it. So
right. I guess related to, let's say you finally you spin up your platform team, or you have your first platform team hire a dedicated, I hate the term, but like your dedicated like DevOps person, like
sure.
I'm going to abuse the word DevOps here. One challenge I can imagine companies have is like they see, the giants of, like, oh, we need to use Spinnaker and we need to build our own service catalog tooling because that's what Groupon does. And we need to have this crazy sophisticated merge train set up so we can be hyper efficient. How do you kind of balance the like standing on the shoulders of giants and leveraging or working towards best practices that like the giants have done versus just getting something out the door?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we have a tendency in the industry to sort of jump on whatever, Google, Facebook, Amazon,
Kubernetes
Netflix,
actually is another example.
right?
It's like, Google did Kubernetes and now everybody's like, oh, we need Kubernetes. Like, do you really need it though?
Yeah, I think it depends. I actually like Kubernetes for a variety of reasons, but it has to be the right reasons. I wouldn't do it for some little pet project. I think if you need, dynamically scaling, self-healing microservices that are like globally distributed, sure, great. Kubernetes is a good tool. If you don't need all those things, then yeah, it might be more complexity than you're looking for. And so, like I was saying, I think there's a tendency to sort of jump on whatever the big 5 or big 6 companies are doing, because there's a lot of value to it, and they put a ton of investment in it, and they write a lot of blogs about it, and it's all supported by the community. And so it's hard to not feel like, hey, I should be going to do those things. I personally tend to take a bit more of a pragmatic approach there and think, at that scale, where say a Google can invest an entire team or an entire office into a particular solution, maybe we in these sort of mid-range to larger companies don't, we can't afford that type of investment. And so what you end up with is leveraging that for sort of the best practices that they advertise and saying, okay, this is kind of our North Star. This is what we should be going for. We may agree with them, but we can't dive headfirst in and just have, automated continuous delivery with sort of AI that's analyzing our logs and our metrics and rolling back automatically and all that stuff. Where we're at, I think at Groupon, we're embracing that concept, but we're sort of taking steps towards it as opposed to just, diving right in and saying, if you're not doing continuous delivery with automated rollbacks, you're a failure. So I think a lot of that is really good, but it requires a lot of sort of foundational work to make it work right. And so at the end of the day, it becomes a priority decision for the teams. Because if you don't have, 30 engineers to dedicate to this sort of, let's just say for the CD solution, for instance, then you kind of have to pick and choose which bits of it are most important to your org, because the rest of your time is going to be spent doing other priorities. So,
right. Before we wrap up today, one final question, and this is the most important one, is what's your favorite beer?
Favorite beer? That's a tough one because I live in Michigan, and the microbrewery scene here is very strong. But I'm from Wisconsin, and so we grew up drinking.
Also a good beer state.
Yeah, it's also a very good beer state. Maybe I'll just say what I'm drinking right now. I've been drinking a lot of Bell's Official, which it's kind of this like old school can. It almost looks like an old Schlitz or Miller Lite or something, but it's like a hazy IPA, which I know is probably passe at this point, but I still like them. So
cool.
Yeah.
Is it like is it super hoppy or is it a little bit like
yeah, it's pretty hoppy.
Okay.
Hoppy, piney, hazy thing. Out of Bell's, which is Kalamazoo, Michigan. So just trying to stay close to home with those microbrews. But yeah, maybe we should have a whole other podcast dedicated to that for a different time.
I love it. Well, Seth, thanks again so much. This wraps up today's episode of Level Up. And until next time, everyone.